4:30 a.m., the front door clicked open. I was standing barefoot on the cold kitchen tile, one hand stirring a pan of eggs, the other cradling my 2-month-old son against my chest. He'd finally fallen asleep after hours of soft crying, his tiny fingers curled into the fabric of my shirt, like he was afraid I might disappear. The house smelled like coffee and butter, like routine, like everything I had been holding together by myself. My husband walked in without looking at me, his jacket still on, his eyes tired, but not the kind of tired that comes from work, the kind that comes from somewhere else. He loosened his tie, glanced at the table I had set for his parents, his sister, the whole family that would be awake in less than 2 hours. And then he said it. Divorce. Just like that. No explanation, no hesitation, not even anger. Just a word dropped into the room like it meant nothing. I didn't answer. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I simply tightened my hold on my baby, turned off the stove, and stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the silence settle between us. Then I moved. I walked past him without a word, went into the bedroom, and pulled out a suitcase from the closet. The same suitcase I had used when I moved into this house 3 years ago, believing I was building a life. I packed slowly, a few clothes, diapers, bottles, the essentials. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me the most. When I came back into the hallway, he was leaning against the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. "Where are you going?" he asked almost casually. I looked at him for the first time since he walked in. Out. And then I opened the door and left. The sky was still dark, just beginning to fade into that quiet blue before sunrise. The world felt suspended, like it hadn't caught up to what had just happened inside that house. I strapped my son into his car seat, slid into the driver's seat, and sat there for a moment. No plan. No destination. Just a strange, steady clarity. They thought I was leaving with nothing. They were wrong. My name is Emily, and until that morning I believed I was doing everything right. I believed in patience, in keeping the peace, in showing up for my family even when it felt like no one was showing up for me. When I married Mark, he wasn't like this. He was attentive, responsible, the kind of man who opened doors and asked how my day was. We built something that felt solid, at least that's what I thought. But things changed, slowly, quietly. It started after we moved into his parents' house temporarily, just for a few months, he had said, while we finalized paperwork on our own place. Those few months turned into a year. Then another. By the time I got pregnant, I had already become part of the rhythm of that household. I woke up early, cooked breakfast, cleaned, helped his mother with errands, hosted family dinners, smiled through comments that were always just polite enough not to be called rude. "You're so lucky Mark works so hard. It's good you're home, you can take care of things. Family comes first, sweetheart." I told myself it was normal. That this was what marriage looked like. Mark worked late more often. He stopped asking about my day, stopped noticing the small things, stopped noticing me. When our son was born, I thought things might shift. They didn't. If anything, the gap grew wider. Sleepless nights became my responsibility. Feeding schedules, doctor appointments, endless laundry, it all fell on me. And still, every morning I made breakfast for everyone. Because that's what I had always done. Because no one else would. There were signs, of course. Late nights, that didn't make sense. Phone calls he took outside. A growing distance I couldn't quite name. But I ignored them. Not because I didn't see them. Because I didn't want to break what little stability I thought we still had. That morning at 4:30 a.m. he broke it for me. I drove without thinking, the quiet hum of the road filling the car as my son slept behind me. The first light of day stretched across the horizon, soft and indifferent. I wasn't crying. I wasn't panicking. I was remembering. Every moment I had made myself smaller. Every time I had chosen silence. Every piece of myself I had slowly set aside to keep everything else intact. And for the first time in a long time, I asked myself a simple question. What do I do now? The answer didn't come right away. But something else did. A realization. I wasn't as powerless as they thought. I wasn't as unaware as they assumed. And I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I glanced in the rearview mirror at my son, peaceful, unaware of the world he had just been carried out of. "I've got you," I whispered. But deep down I knew. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about what came next. And they had no idea what I was capable of. I didn't go far. Just across town to a small, quiet neighborhood where the houses were older and the trees had been there longer than anyone could remember. I parked in front of a pale blue home with a narrow porch and a wind chime that rang softly in the early morning breeze. Mrs. Henderson's house. She had been my neighbor before I got married, back when I still lived in my tiny one-bedroom apartment, and believed life would expand, not narrow. She was retired, widowed, and sharper than anyone gave her credit for, the kind of woman who noticed everything but only spoke when it mattered. When she opened the door and saw me standing there with a baby, a suitcase, and eyes that had clearly not slept, she didn't ask questions. She simply stepped aside and said, "Come in, Emily." That was the first kindness I allowed myself to feel in a long time. By mid-morning, my son was fed and asleep again, curled into a borrowed bassinet near the window. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting soft patterns across his face. For a moment, everything looked peaceful. But peace has a way of bringing clarity. And clarity brings truth. Mrs. Henderson set a cup of coffee in front of me and sat across the table, folding her hands like she was waiting for me to begin. So I did. Not with tears, not with anger, just facts. "He came home at 4:30, I said. Said divorce. That was it. She nodded once, as if confirming something she had already suspected. "And you left," she added. "Yes." Another nod. "Good." That surprised me. "You don't think I should have tried to talk?" "No," she said firmly, though her voice stayed gentle. "Men who speak that way aren't starting conversations, Emily. They're ending them." I sat with that for a moment. It felt accurate. The truth is, I had been preparing for something like this. Not consciously, not in a way I would have admitted out loud, but in small, quiet decisions over time. I used to handle bookkeeping before I got married. Nothing glamorous, but enough to understand how money moves, how numbers tell stories people try to hide. When Mark started coming home later, when expenses stopped adding up the way they used to, when his explanations became shorter and less convincing, I noticed. I didn't confront him. I observed. And I kept copies. Bank statements, property documents, insurance records. Nothing stolen, nothing illegal. Just things I had access to as his wife. Things I chose not to ignore. At first I told myself it was just for peace of mind. Then it became something else. A quiet safeguard. "I need to call a lawyer," I said finally. Mrs. Henderson didn't hesitate. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small notepad. "I know someone," she said. "Used to handle my husband's estate years ago. Fair. Doesn't play games." She wrote down a name and number and slid it across the table. I looked at it for a long moment. This was the point where things became real. Legal. Irreversible. "Emily," she added softly, "you don't have to destroy anyone, but you do have to protect yourself." I nodded. That distinction mattered. The call was scheduled for that afternoon. In the hours leading up to it, I sat by the window watching my son sleep, replaying the last 2 years in my mind, not through emotion, but through pattern. What I had missed. What I had chosen not to see. Mark had always been good with appearances, responsible, reliable, the kind of man people trusted without question. But behind that, things were shifting. Accounts that didn't quite match his salary. Contributions to the house that he had always framed as his. But they weren't. Not entirely. When we first moved in, I had used a portion of a small inheritance from my father to help cover renovations. It wasn't something I talked about much. Mark had insisted it was temporary, that we'd even things out later. We never did. And somehow, over time, the narrative changed. The house became his. The effort became his. The story became his. But numbers don't forget. And I hadn't either. The lawyer's office was quiet, understated. No polished marble or intimidating decor, just bookshelves, soft lighting, and a man in his late 60s who greeted me with a steady handshake and direct eye contact. "Emily," he said, gesturing for me to sit, "tell me what's going on." So I did. Again, no dramatics. Just facts. When I finished, he leaned back slightly, considering. "And you have documentation?" he asked. "Yes." I handed over the folder I had brought with me. Copies only. Originals safe. He flipped through them slowly, methodically. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was evaluative. Finally, he closed the folder and looked at me. "You're not in a weak position," he said. Something in my chest shifted. Not relief. Not yet. But recognition. All of this, he continued, tapping the folder lightly, tells a very different story than the one your husband is likely expecting to present. I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "What do I do?" I asked. He didn't rush the answer. "We proceed carefully," he said. "We file for custody, we initiate financial discovery, and most importantly, we don't underestimate him." A pause. "Because he's already underestimated you." That night back at Mrs. Henderson's house, I sat in the quiet living room, my son asleep beside me, the weight of the day settling in. For the first time since I walked out that door, I allowed myself to feel something close to steadiness. Not because things were resolved, but because they were finally in motion. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was deciding. And that made all the difference. I looked down at my son, gently brushing a finger across his cheek. "We're going to be okay," I whispered. And this time, I believed it. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for someone else to change. I was already moving forward. The paperwork began quietly. No dramatic confrontations, no slammed doors, just signatures, filings, and a series of measured steps that would slowly reshape everything Mark thought he controlled. 3 days after I left, my lawyer filed for temporary custody. By the end of the week, we initiated financial discovery. And by the second week, Mark finally called. I didn't answer the first time. Or the second. On the third, I let it ring for a moment longer than necessary, then picked up. "Emily." His voice was tight, controlled, but beneath it something unfamiliar, uncertainty. "Yes." A pause. "Where are you?" "Safe." Another pause, longer this time. "You can't just take my son and disappear." I closed my eyes briefly, steadying myself. "He's not just your son," I said calmly. Silence. Then a shift in tone, sharper now. "What is this, some kind of punishment?" "No," I replied, "it's a response." He exhaled sharply, like he was trying to regain footing. "Look, whatever this is, we can figure it out. You don't need lawyers involved." "They already are." That landed. I could hear it in the way his breathing changed, in the way his next words came slower, more deliberate. "You're overreacting." I almost smiled. Because that word overreacting had followed me for years. Every concern dismissed. Every question softened into doubt. Every instinct I had, minimized. "Not anymore." "No," I said quietly, "I'm responding appropriately." And then I ended the call. The next move didn't come from him. It came from his mother. She showed up at Mrs. Henderson's house unannounced 2 days later, her posture stiff, her expression carefully arranged somewhere between concern and disapproval. Mrs. Henderson opened the door before I could reach it. "Yes," she asked, her tone polite but immovable. "I'm here to see Emily," she said, peering past her like I might be hiding. Mrs. Henderson didn't move. "You can say what you need to say right here." There was a brief standoff, one woman used to being listened to, another who had no intention of yielding. Finally, Mark's mother sighed. "This is unnecessary," she said, loud enough for me to hear. "Running off with a baby involving lawyers, it's dramatic." I stepped forward then. "Good morning," I said evenly. She turned to me, her eyes scanning quickly, taking in the absence of apology, the lack of visible distress. "You need to come home," she said, as if it were obvious. "Whatever disagreement you and Mark are having, it doesn't require all this." "It wasn't a disagreement," I replied. "He asked for a divorce." She waved a hand dismissively. "Men say things. It doesn't mean you dismantle a family over it." I held her gaze. "And what would you have me do? Stay, pretend it didn't happen?" Her expression tightened. "For the sake of the child, yes." There it was. The same quiet expectation I had lived under for years. Endure, adjust, maintain. I shook my head. "No." The word felt simple. Solid. Final. Something flickered in her eyes, then something that looked a lot like surprise. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice colder now. "Maybe," I replied, "but it's mine to make." She looked like she wanted to argue further, but Mrs. Henderson shifted slightly beside me, a subtle reminder that this wasn't her house, and she wasn't in control here. After a moment, she turned and walked away. No goodbye. No resolution. Just the quiet realization that things were no longer going according to her expectations. By the time Mark received the official notice, the tone changed. No more casual calls. No more assumptions that I would come back. Instead, there were messages. Short, direct, increasingly urgent. We need to talk. This is getting out of hand. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I didn't respond. Not because I was avoiding him, but because I had already said everything that needed to be said. Now the process would speak. The first real shift came during financial review. Mark had always handled the outward narrative, his job, his income, his role as provider. But documentation tells a broader story. Accounts that had been moved. Funds that didn't align with declared expenses. And more importantly, contributions that had been overlooked. Mine. The inheritance I had quietly invested into the house. The shared accounts I had monitored. The patterns I had tracked over time. None of it dramatic. All of it precise. When my lawyer laid it out piece by piece, the reaction on the other side wasn't outrage. It was surprise. Because the version of me they had built, the quiet, accommodating, uninvolved wife, didn't match the one sitting across from them now. And that disconnect created leverage. But none of this felt easy. At night, when the house was quiet and my son stirred softly beside me, the weight of it all settled in. Not fear. Not regret. Just gravity. This wasn't a game. It was a dismantling. Of a life I had built. Of roles I had accepted. Of a version of myself that no longer fit. There were moments I questioned everything. Moments I wondered if it would have been simpler to stay. To smooth things over. To return to what was familiar. But then I would remember that morning. 4:30 a.m. The way he said divorce like it was nothing. And I knew. Going back wasn't an option. 2 weeks in the court scheduled an initial hearing. Nothing final. Just the beginning of formal proceedings. But it was enough. Enough to shift the balance. Enough to make it clear that this wasn't temporary. This wasn't emotional. This was structural. And it was moving forward with or without his cooperation. The night before the hearing, I stood by the window watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. My son was asleep, his breathing soft and steady. I rested a hand lightly on his back, grounding myself in something real. I'm not doing this out of anger, I whispered. And that was the truth. This wasn't about revenge in the way people imagine it. There was no desire to hurt. No need to destroy. Only a quiet, unwavering commitment to be seen clearly. To be treated fairly. To no longer disappear inside someone else's expectations. The next morning I dressed simply. Neutral colors. Minimal makeup. Nothing that tried to prove anything beyond what was already true. As I looked at my reflection, I didn't see someone broken. I saw someone defined. Not by what had happened, but by what she chose next. When I stepped into that courtroom, I wasn't the woman who had stood in the kitchen weeks earlier holding everything together in silence. I was someone else now. Someone who understood the value of her own voice, even when she used it quietly. And as the process began, as the first formal words were spoken, and the structure of the case took shape, one thing became unmistakably clear. He had expected me to return. To fold. To apologize. Instead, I had answered. And that answer was already changing everything. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Not the towering, dramatic space people imagine, but a quiet, functional room where lives were adjusted in measured tones and documented in neat stacks of paper. Mark was already there when I walked in. For a moment, everything slowed. He looked the same. Same pressed shirt, same controlled posture, but something in his expression had shifted. The certainty was gone, replaced by something tighter, more watchful. He hadn't expected this version of me. I could see it immediately. Our eyes met briefly. He gave a small nod like we were acquaintances passing in a hallway. I returned it. Nothing more. No anger, no softness, just acknowledgement. We took our seats, and then the process began. It wasn't explosive. No dramatic accusations, no raised voices, just facts presented clearly, carefully, and in a way that left very little room for interpretation. Custody. Finances. Contributions. Responsibilities. Words that used to feel abstract now carried weight. Real consequences. When my lawyer spoke, he didn't exaggerate, he didn't attack. He simply laid out the timeline. My role in the household. My financial contributions documented, verified. The sudden nature of Mark's decision. The presence of a 2-month-old child in all of this. At one point I glanced at Mark. His jaw had tightened slightly. Not anger. Recognition. Because for the first time the story wasn't being told his way. The financial review hit harder than anything else. Accounts that had once been vague were now precise. Movements of money traced. Assumptions challenged. And the house that had always been framed as his responsibility, was no longer that simple. My inheritance. My input. My silent investment in what I believed was a shared future. All of it brought into the light. Mark's attorney adjusted his posture, flipping through documents more quickly, now recalibrating. That was the moment the balance shifted. Not dramatically, but undeniably. After the hearing, Mark approached me in the hallway. Not aggressively. Carefully. "Emily," he said, his voice lower than usual. I turned to face him. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he exhaled. "I didn't think you'd do all this." There it was. Not an apology. Not yet. Just honesty. "I know," I replied. Another pause. "This isn't how I wanted things to go," he added. I held his gaze. "This isn't how they started either." That landed. You could see it in the way his shoulders dropped slightly, like something he had been holding on to no longer had the same weight. "I thought you'd come back," he admitted. "I know," I said again. And I did. Because I had spent years being predictable. Accommodating. Manageable. This wasn't something he had prepared for. The next few weeks unfolded with quiet intensity. No shouting matches. No public scenes. Just steady movement. Documents filed. Schedules adjusted. Conversations that were no longer emotional but procedural. And through it all, something unexpected began to happen. The tone shifted. Not entirely, but enough to notice. Mark stopped trying to control the situation. Stopped framing everything as a misunderstanding. Instead, he started asking questions. Real ones. About custody schedules. About what I needed. About what would be fair. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. But it was different. His parents, too, began to change. Not overnight, but gradually. His mother called one afternoon. Her voice still composed but softer than before. "I didn't realize how much you were handling," she said. No apology. But closer. I thought things were balanced. I listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't correct. Just let the silence do what it needed to do. "We should have paid more attention," she added quietly. That was as far as she could go. And for now, it was enough. At night, when everything slowed down, I found myself thinking less about what had been taken from me, and more about what had been revealed. Not just about Mark, or his family, but about myself. The parts of me that had adapted too easily. The ways I had mistaken endurance for strength. The quiet compromises that had slowly rewritten my boundaries. This wasn't just about a marriage ending. It was about a pattern breaking. One evening, as I sat by the window with my son asleep in my arms, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry. Not in the way I expected. There was no burning need for revenge. No desire to make him feel what I had felt. Instead, there was clarity. A calm understanding of what had happened. And what needed to happen next. Justice didn't have to be loud. It just had to be accurate. The final agreements came together slowly. Custody shared but stable. Finances restructured with fairness finally reflected on paper. The house no longer a symbol of imbalance but a resolved asset. Nothing excessive. Nothing punitive. Just correct. And when it was done, when the last document was signed and the process officially closed, there was no dramatic moment. No sense of victory. Just a quiet shift. Like something that had been misaligned for a long time had finally been set back into place. Mark asked to meet one last time. Not to argue. Not to negotiate. Just to talk. We met at a small park halfway between our two places. Neutral ground. Our son slept in his stroller between us, unaware of the history sitting on either side. Mark looked different. Not physically, but in the way he held himself. Less certain. More present. I didn't see it, he said after a while. I didn't ask what he meant. I thought providing was enough, he continued. I didn't realize what it cost you. I nodded slightly. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Because understanding even late still mattered. I'm trying to do better, he added. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a solution. But it was a beginning. As we sat there in the quiet, something settled between us. Not reconciliation. Not yet, but something steadier. Respect. The kind that doesn't come from comfort but from truth. When I stood to leave, I didn't feel like I was walking away anymore. I felt like I was moving forward. On my own terms. With clarity. With balance. And with something I hadn't had in a long time. A life that actually reflected who I was. The first time I woke up in my own place, it was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar but not empty. Just calm. A small 2-bedroom rental on a tree-lined street. Nothing impressive. The floors creaked a little and the kitchen window stuck if you didn't lift it just right. But it was ours. Mine and my son's. No expectations waiting in the hallway. No voices measuring what I had or hadn't done. Just space. I stood by the window that morning holding a cup of coffee in one hand and watching the early light settle across the neighborhood. My son was asleep in his crib behind me, breathing softly, steady, and safe. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't bracing for the day. I was simply in it. The routine we built wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Feeding schedules, short walks, quiet afternoons. I started picking up small bookkeeping clients again, nothing overwhelming, just enough to rebuild something that belonged to me. There was a rhythm to it. Not the kind I had before where everything revolved around maintaining someone else's world. This one felt balanced. Earned. Mark kept his word. At first I expected inconsistency, missed visits, excuses. But he showed up. Not always confidently, not always knowing what to do. But he came. He learned how to hold his son without looking uncertain, learned how to prepare a bottle, learned how to sit in the quiet without reaching for distraction. It wasn't dramatic. It was gradual. And that made it real. One afternoon as he stood in the doorway after dropping the baby off, he hesitated. "Emily," he said. I looked up from the small pile of paperwork on the table. "I've been thinking about everything." I didn't interrupt. "I don't expect things to go back," he continued. "I know that's not where we are, but I want to make sure I don't repeat it." There was no defensiveness in his voice, no attempt to reshape the past. Just a quiet acknowledgement of it. "That matters," I said. And it did. Not because it erased anything, but because it showed awareness, the kind that can't be forced. His parents reached out too. Less formally this time. A phone call, then a visit. His mother stood in my doorway the same way she had weeks earlier, but she looked different now. Not smaller, just less certain of her assumptions. "I brought something," she said, holding up a small container. Homemade soup. Simple. Unspoken. I stepped aside to let her in. We sat at the same table where I now worked, where my son's things were scattered in the soft, honest way of a lived-in home. She looked around slowly. "You've made a good place here," she said. It wasn't a compliment she would have given before. "Thank you," I replied. There was a pause. Then quieter. We didn't see it clearly. No explanation. No justification. Just that. I nodded once. And for the first time it felt like we were speaking from the same level, not roles, not expectations, just people. Time moved the way it always does, quietly, steadily, without asking permission. Weeks turned into months. My son grew stronger, more alert. His small smiles came easier now, his eyes tracking movement, recognizing voices. He knew mine. And he knew Mark's. That mattered more than anything. There was no grand reconciliation. No moment where everything reset and we stepped back into something familiar. Because that wasn't the goal. What we built instead was something quieter. More honest. Co-parenting that required communication, not assumption. Respect that came from understanding, not obligation. Boundaries that didn't need to be defended constantly because they were finally recognized. One evening after a long day, I sat on the floor beside my son, as he played with a soft fabric toy, his small hands exploring the world one texture at a time. The room was warm, filled with the low hum of everyday life, and I realized something that settled deep without resistance. I hadn't lost everything. I had let go of something that no longer held me properly. There's a difference. A quiet but important one.